I'm Dr. Johnny Lewis, and I want to thank you for coming to this presentation about religious expression in schools. And this is a review for district staff as we think about religious expression and all the different ways that we encounter it during the school day between staff and students, what we can do to create the healthiest environment for students and staff, and also to take our legal responsibility seriously. So our current policy as a district allows for teaching about religion and religious traditions using art, music, poetry, religious texts when it's necessary and helpful to convey curriculum standards in a content area. I know that some of our students in literature courses read texts from the Quran or from the Hebrew Bible in different instances and talk about the poetry of those texts. These are those kinds of examples. Also, our current policy allows for displaying religious symbols as long as they're for an educational purpose and as long as they're shown with the symbols of other major religions without any preference or hierarchy. An example of that might be in a world history class where the three Abrahamic religions are discussed together and are discussed without any preference or hierarchy, and where the symbols are displayed for each of those religions in a way that doesn't preference one over the other. Our current policy does not allow for preferring or negatively critiquing religions, for talking about one particular religion and displaying and discussing it negatively or discussing others as being better than or worse than. The same with religious texts or religious traditions that some of our students or their families may follow, depending on what background they may be from. Our current policy does not allow for school-sponsored ceremonies of any kind that are religious in nature. That includes both sponsored religious ceremonies that could happen perhaps in the classroom or in school assemblies or anywhere else on school facilities and initiated by district staff. One of the things that's happening in our communities around the country is that they're increasing in religious diversity. And so there was a point where there was kind of one dominant religion, and the solution to some of the conversations we had about equal access in the schools was just to kind of try to make schools basically like a religion-free zone. And one of the things that educators are finding is that as we increase in religious diversity, and there are a variety of different religious expressions around us, that it's changing the helpful and healthiest responses that we can make as leaders. And so our current policy still leaves some situations up for interpretation of our staff, which can then, without providing them further guidance, it could put them at risk of litigation, or it could put them in a personally uncomfortable position of discernment. Let me give you some examples. These are real world situations that are unaddressed by our policy and probably by most district policies. This is from an article from NPR from 2020. At one elementary school, a staff person considered the Ash Wednesday ashes of a 9-year-old student, so a third grade student, a violation of that staff person's rights to have to see that and consider that form of religious expression unlawful. A high school football team in one school in the United States requested to be baptized together at the school as a team activity. And then a common one that is familiar and has happened several times in our country, a coach of a certain team leads the whole team in prayer together after the game. It's a team activity. And so in each of these instances, these are a little more specific, and they open up for some interpretation by our staff. And so what we want to do is provide some guidance that might be helpful to staff when making those kinds of determinations. So a summary of the Supreme Court rulings related to religion in schools is that the legality of religious action in schools hinges on whether private speech has been initiated by a student. Private religious speech initiated by a student is allowed. This, for example, could be a student praying in the cafeteria before they eat their meal, or having a conversation with a peer during unstructured time about their faith. This sort of private initiated language is allowed. Sponsored, coerced, or developed speech that involves clergy or district staff is not allowed. So, for example, if a student writes their valedictory speech and they mention their faith of their own choosing in that speech, that's private speech that's initiated by a student. If, however, district staff is involved in writing that speech and the student is coerced or is partnered by district staff in coercing those who are part of the audience for that speech, then that would not be allowed. And so here's some current guidance, most recent guidance from the U.S. Department of Education related to religious activity in schools. Students may pray or read religious texts independently in unstructured school time. Again, this could be a student praying in the cafeteria or reading their Bible between classes. Student-sponsored religious clubs must have equal access to time and facilities as other clubs. Many of our schools have FCAs that are given the same access to the student body, to advertising their activities, to meeting times as all the other clubs in our schools. They must have the same access. Staff may take time for prayer, for private religious activities, just as they may take time for a personal phone call on their lunch break or during another unstructured time during their day. Students may be dismissed during instructional time for religious practice. For example, many students during Ramadan who are Muslim need time or space to pray. It is perfectly legal for the school to provide the student that time and that space to do so privately if they request that. Schools may not sponsor religious events or coerce participation, but student speakers, for example, at school graduation who choose to invoke their religious faith during a neutral speech are free to do so. Schools may not sponsor a baccalaureate service, and so we may not suggest that DeSoto High School is having a baccalaureate service sponsored by our staff and make it a part of our program as a school. However, if there are people, whether they're clergy or volunteers or parents who are organizing baccalaureate services and would like to use our facilities, if we are allowing our facilities to be used by other organizations, which we do during graduation season, then legally we must allow our facilities to be rented or used or accessed. However, other organizations are allowed to do so for those events as well. They just may not be school sponsored, and students may not be coerced to attend that baccalaureate service. Student dress code that allows other free expression may not create dress codes that limit religious expression. And so in our district, we don't have like a very standard dress code with like khakis and a red shirt for everyone, for example. Students are allowed to wear t-shirts with slogans or band names or any of those things. And because of that, because that's our dress code, we must make room for religious expression, barring there a compelling reason not to. So an example that I think of when I think about compelling reasoning, our schools have a no hat policy, most of them, because of security camera footage or whatever. If we had a student who desired to wear a hijab during school, even though we have a no headgear policy because it's less convenient for us related to cameras, I think it would be arguable that there's no compelling reason for preventing one of our students to wear a hijab as a form of religious expression, given that other students are allowed to wear different clothing that allows for their expression. That would also cover ashes on Ash Wednesday, cross necklaces, things like that. And so this is just kind of a summary of good policies to think about when we think about religion in our school district. Most importantly, avoid any coercion toward religious expression by staff. Students cannot be forced to pray, to participate in a worship service, they cannot be forced to be part of a team prayer led by a coach that every player is expected to participate in. All of those are coerced religious expressions. We cannot allow religious preference to interfere with curriculum standards and student learning. And so, we may have a variety of staff who have different feelings about creationism versus scientific theory. Our standards, our curriculum standards as a state, are what we must teach in the classroom, regardless of any religious preference that someone may have when they're interpreting those things. In the same way, if they're reading, if in school we're reading a text from the Hebrew Bible, for example, and someone would prefer not, and a teacher may not speak negatively or interfere with curriculum teaching by coercing or speaking negatively about that particular text. It is important that we make inclusion and access the norm for private expression by our students of all faith traditions. As our communities continue to grow and religious diversity, the idea that we can make schools a completely religion-free zone as a way of protecting ourselves from having to kind of make these decisions just seems impossible at this point. Instead, what we have to be thinking about is how we are protecting students' rights to their private expression while making sure that we are not engaging in coercion in such a way that burdens other students to participate in a religious activity. And so rather than trying to make our schools religion-free zones, we must move toward making our schools places where students are allowed to express and also encouraged to tolerate religious expressions of their peers. And so I thank you for viewing this presentation. This lesson supports standard NLS 6 by creating a tool for educating staff related to the legal rights of staff and students in matters of religious expression to encourage the well-being of each. It is relevant and added to my learning by encouraging me to review and critique district policy related to religious expression when compared to the U.S. Department of Education guidance and to changing demographics in the community. This assignment will influence my decisions as a future building leader by providing me with the important understanding of how to make schools a place where students and staff of all religious perspectives are included and have access to expression so long as it does not burden others. These are the sources used for the creation of this presentation. Thank you.